Hi, everybody. So last time we sorted living and non-living things, and today we're going to talk about how the scientists look at life and define life. And if we look back at what we had seen last time, we've got all these different living things. We've got plants, which are living. We've got invertebrates, that's things without backbones, like the jellyfish. And the snail that are invertebrates without a backbone. We've got vertebrates like birds and reptiles and mammals, including humans, which are mammals. We are an animal. And then we have one-celled organisms like bacteria and like this, which is an amoeba. And then we have our non-living things, right? Tables, cars, fire, and this is a virus. That's the virus COVID-19, the one that brought the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. And so we have lots of different things that we've classified. Now, I'm going to say that fire and viruses are actually a lot harder to figure out where they go than it first seems. And we'll talk about that today. Fire and viruses have big question marks on them. So let's start by talking about what makes something living. And usually students will say something like, they grow, right? They grow. These things start small. You don't see a table growing, but all these things, they start little and they get big. But there's some problems with that. For example, fire. Fire grows, right? It starts as a little spark and it gets larger. Not only that, you could say that fire reproduces. It can shoot a little spark over to another place and start a new little baby fire, right? And so how would that not be reproduction? So growth and reproduction are a big question mark. So we can say living things grow, but fire's iffy. And maybe to distinguish fire, we could say, wow, well, living things are really organized. Fire is just like this energy. It doesn't have structure to it, right? So maybe that's the case. But, there are some living things like the amoeba that don't have a definite shape. They change shape all the time. They actually shoot their insides all around in funny directions and can make projections called pseudopods in one place and then another. And so a definite form is, a little tricky. It really doesn't necessarily apply. And so scientists have really said, look at fire and look at an amoeba. The really key difference here, as you all learned in previous grades, is that amoebas and all living things are made of cells, right? Cells, that's really critical here. And we can distinguish fire and the car and the table from all those living things, because all those living things have cells. Every time we've ever taken something that was alive and put it on a microscope, lo and behold, it was made of cells. And so we can say, fire is not living and all the other things are living. And we can define that as different because they have cells. And along comes a big problem. At one point, we finally made a microscope that was strong enough to see really small things called viruses. Now, viruses, this is the COVID-19 virus that caused the pandemic. Viruses are not made of cells. They do reproduce, they grow, they build up their materials once they infect a cell, like a whole bunch of different parasites that live inside of other organisms. This lives inside of another organism. And so it's not made of cells, but it sure seems alive. And so how we distinguish that's a really important question. And if we look at the size, they are 130 nanometers. That's 0.13 microns. And a human cell is 100 microns. So we're talking about tiny. You can fit hundreds and hundreds of them. This is a bacterial cell, and bacteria are tiny compared to human cells. And these are viruses making the bacterium sick. Each of these little things out here is a virus. They're tiny, even compared to the very smallest cells that exist, that is bacteria. So what do we do with that? Well, scientists have said, okay, viruses aren't alive. I mean, that seems a little disingenuous, right? I mean, they act alive, but okay, they're not living because they're not made of cells. That's one way you can deal with this, and some scientists have done that. And some other scientists say, they're alive, they act alive, but they're just an exception. Of course, if we say that viruses are an exception and can be alive even without cells, we're back to fire. Fire grows, it reproduces, it uses energy. It sure doesn't seem like a living thing. And so this is really kind of shows that it is difficult to define life. It's very challenging. And the truth is that there's a whole bunch of stuff out there in nature. There's rocks, and there's humans, and there's viruses, and there's cars, and there's fire, and there's suns. And human beings, scientists, are trying to say, these are living, and these are not. But it's actually a continuum, and it's not entirely clear what's what. And we're going to see that over and over again in biology. Nature does whatever the heck nature wants to do. And it is scientists who are trying to make sense of nature by classifying them. Classifying is useful. I can say to you something is alive, and it means something, and you have an idea about it. It's an important classification, but it is not hard and fast, and it is not something created in nature. It's created by scientists trying to make sense of things like cows and humans and cars, and then they get stumbling on viruses and fire. At any rate, scientists have come down to essentially 9 characteristics. If you have all 9, you're considered living, and there'll be some exceptions. So, highly organized and many complex chemical substances. That is definitely the case. Made of cells. This is really important. This is probably the most defining characteristic. Living things are made of cells, and it is the smallest unit can be alive, so a virus is considered non-living or an exception. They use energy. We take in energy all the time. We are busy eating and doing, and so are plants. They don't eat, they make their own food, but they're taking in energy and they are doing. And we'll talk about all the ways that they do throughout the year. Have a definite form and limited size. Again, we've got the amoeba. It's kind of iffy, but we'll go with it because it's the official definition. Have a limited lifespan. Unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, but every living thing dies, and that's just a reality. Some things will live 2,000 years. There's some trees that are alive in Australia that have clearly been alive for thousands of years. That definitely is the case, but still, everything will die. So if it has a limited lifespan, it can be classified as living. Growth, we talked about that. Living things get bigger. Respond to changes in the environment. So if something happens, if the light moves, if the sun moves, then plants will be responsive to that. If it's warm in a certain place, a turtle might move over to that spot to get warm. So there's things that happen in our environment and we respond to it. We're able to reproduce. Living things reproduce and create offspring like themselves and evolve. And that is the only one that doesn't apply to individuals, just populations. So if you meet these 9 characteristics, you are officially alive, even though we have some troublesome organisms, depending on how you define them, because organism is something that is alive. Even though we have these troublesome things to define, if you have all 9 of these, you are definitely considered living. And we will say that viruses are an exception and considered alive or are non-living. And those are the characteristics of living things.